Hi, everyone, and welcome to God's Plan, Your Part, a podcast where our goal is to read the entire Bible in a year, seeking to understand God's plan of redemption while discovering daily and practically your part in it. Hey, everybody, welcome back to God's Plan, Your Part. Today we are in Leviticus chapters 11 through 13 with you guys, and we are just going through a lot of boundaries and rules regarding what is clean and unclean to eat, what is clean and unclean for people in general as they are just kind of living life among the Israelite people. There are rules about leprosy and childbirth and all kinds of things in these chapters that might seem a little cringy, but I think getting a little bit of background information is going to be really helpful for us. So, Ryan, want to start us out?
So I think as we get into some of these passages, it's important to kind of zoom out and understand what's happening. So God is allowing the people of Israel to be his nation of priests. Like they're a holy nation of priests that represent God to the world. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things God is going to ask of this nation of priests is that they live unique lives that are easily recognized as different. Right. And so when we get into these rules, and we've seen some of these already, but when we deal with these concepts of clean or unclean, or what is acceptable, what's unacceptable, some of these things are going to be just plain good health decisions. We're going to see that specifically in chapter 13. Some of these are going to be just distinctives. Like, you know what? You don't eat crabs because I told you not to eat crabs. Like, there's going to be things that are just called out because God has asked them to be called out so that these people actually live and look different, because it draws attention to himself. That's what God's doing. He is bringing glory on himself. I was
just going to say something else that's helpful to remember too as we're looking through all of these rules, regulations, clean and unclean, is this is a very different time in history. We have come so far, and things do look different for us today in that we are a much more advanced people, and we have a lot more, what would you call that? We just have a lot more.
There's a lot more available to us.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And so one of the concepts that's hard for us is clean and unclean. It feels like, oh, these people are good and these people are bad.
It just feels gross.
That's not what this is. It's just ritual purity that is, hey, I want you to come before me this way. It's not good. It's not bad. It's just please be this way. Some of these are cultural distinctives. I want you to look different. Some of these are actually good health decisions, which is kind of cool. You're dealing with a giant nation of people. It's very awesome that God is like, hey, by the way, don't do that. Make sure you handle that this way.
Well, I mean, they didn't have medications like we do to be able to wipe out different diseases or things like that, too. So they could easily be, like, swept out simply because of these bad health choices, in a way.
It's possible. It's also, God is going to preserve his people.
Yes.
So there is the spiritual aspect of God's power as well.
Such a silly tension we often find ourselves with.
There's a lot of really cool New Testament things that come out of just 11 to 13 that we're reading today. So, for example, Leviticus 11 is going to let people know what they can eat and what they can't eat. It does seem like this is not a universal concept. It's not true in every sense that God has. It does seem like animals that eat dead things are not clean. You're not allowed
Lots of vultures.
Exactly.
Don't touch them.
You're not allowed to eat things that eat dead things because death is unclean before God. Another thing that is going to defile an animal is anything that eats something that is unclean.
So, for instance, owls eat mice. Mice are a big no-no. Same for snakes.
It's also possible some of these animals are just things that God said, don't eat them. You might be wondering, why don't we follow these rules anymore? We want to honor God. It's important to be holy before God. Why do we just eat whatever we want? Well, in Acts 10... Peter goes to, I think he's like dealing with Cornelius, and he has this vision where God throws down a sheet with all these unclean animals on it, and he's like, hey, go ahead and eat stuff. And Peter, growing up in this system, is like, what? Like, imagine if you have been told your whole life, don't eat that, that is bad. And then God gives you a vision, and it's like, yeah, go ahead, it's fine. So, and you're going to eventually see in the Jerusalem Council, this is Acts 15, where the early church fathers, the apostles, they're going to say, hey, eat what you want to eat. Just try not to eat food sacrificed to idols, because it's not about that anymore. It's now about honoring Jesus, representing Jesus. We don't have to be as concerned about these things. The very clear question becomes, well, when is it cultural and when is it mandated? And that's a very difficult
What do you mean
distinction.
cultural mandated?
Well, we're going to come up against things that are in Leviticus that are like, well, maybe that was only for that time, just like shrimp.
Oh.
And it's very difficult to discern which is which. But I think the very clear thing for food specifically is that God revealed to Peter that food specifically is not something we need to be concerned about anymore. So maybe a really great way to discern what's allowed and what's not allowed is if God said it's allowed now, you can do it. If God hasn't said yet that it's allowed, it's not allowed.
Don't think about it. Well, then we move into chapter 12, which is all about childbirth, which I think to me, it was actually really interesting being a mother and a woman of 4 babies. I know that post giving birth, it's quite insane. And I know that having children definitely puts you in a place where you don't want to be just around tons of people all the time. Like you are at home with your child, with your newborn baby, and you are, just strictly taking care of it, like healing, recovering yourself. So when reading this, I mean, out of context, without having like birthed a child, some of it might seem like really weird. Like, wow, why would we put a woman through that, like almost like shaming? But it's not meant to be that way. If I would be just out and about doing my thing without any of the advances of today, post giving birth to a child, it would be utterly embarrassing and completely humiliating, and honestly very like harmful to other people. Like you don't want that. Like you need to just give that time. You need to give that space and that time after having a child. And I do think it's really cool that the offerings made afterwards, like that gives the cleanliness for mothers. And I think what's really cool is, Ryan and I were talking about this earlier, is that this offering was actually made by Mary when they went to Jerusalem, when Jesus was, I don't know, pretty young, I guess, right, on their way. But it's cool because we actually see this specific offering taking place with Mary and her turtle doves, or what was it? It was 2 doves?
Yeah, what's interesting about that is that turtle doves provision is for people who are radically poor. And so it just shows us that Jesus, our Savior, was born to a family that was radically poor.
But still went through the same purification process, or I should say cleanliness process after. So I don't necessarily think of this as being like women are less than or anything like that. It's actually really cool because I understand the process of after having a child, just like needing that time. And being able to come before the Lord again, clean.
It's another example of God giving his people directions that is actually just good health.
Yeah.
So speaking of good health, we go into Leviticus 13, and it's all about
leprosy.
Skin diseases. So it can be confusing. We do have a disease known as leprosy today. This isn't necessarily exactly the same thing. It's just skin diseases. And one of the things we're going to see happen in Leviticus 13 is kind of this religious priest take on how to make sure people stay healthy. And so if you develop a skin disease, you go before the priest. The priest has this kind of checklist of what to look for. And if you are, in fact, unclean, or in this case, actually sick, you have to go in quarantine. And then you quarantine for 7 days, and you come back, and the priest checks you again. And if it has cleared up, you're released back to the people. And if you're not, you go quarantine again. So this is just a good health concept. This is, post 2020, how many people are like, quarantine? But this is God giving good direction to his people to keep, again, a huge nation of people healthy.
Something that I thought was really cool when I was reading this, it came to me as this part was being read. I thought immediately of the Gospels, of an instance where Jesus is talking to a leper and he says, go show yourselves to the priest. And that never really made sense to me. Like, why is he going to show himself? Is it just to be like, hey, look at me, look at me? It's actually part of the process. Like, I am miraculously clean because of what that guy did. And I just think that's so cool. Like, this is what we will see play out in the New Testament. And it's going to probably rock the priest that ends up seeing him.
Well, it's amazing.
Because I'm sure he was probably dealing with this for a very long time, at least from what I remember.
Jesus seems to take a real interest in people with leprosy. And I think it's because if you had persistent leprosy, you were cast out of the camp and you were commanded to announce the fact that you were unclean before everybody.
Unclean, yeah.
So imagine if you had to walk around just saying, unclean, unclean, which you could hear that and think, wow, that is awful. but it's actually great for all the other people. So this is something that is elevating community above the individual, which is a really hard concept for us to wrap our heads around. We're very individualistic today. They were not. They would do this to protect the whole. And Jesus is going to go around healing people that have been leprous for a long time and restore them to community, which was an incredible opportunity for those people. A lot of people believe that Bethany, that Jesus, when he visited Jerusalem, liked to stay in Bethany. It's very possible that Bethany was actually a leper colony. And so the fact that Jesus chose to stay there just shows how much he had compassion on people with leprosy and restoring them back to community.
And even kind of piggybacking off of that idea with the chapter 12 of purification after childbirth and menstruation, you have that woman who was bleeding for 8 years.
Yes.
8 years?
She's in the same
it's
situation.
Just years upon years. And Jesus just reaches out, heals her, and
I think it was much longer than 8 years.
Was it?
I think so.
For some reason, 8's in my head. Sorry. Cut that out.
So we won't cut it out. So just today, in looking over Leviticus 11 to 13, there are immediate New Testament concepts that come out of each one of these chapters. And to me, it just goes to show it's really, really hard to understand in fullness the New Testament if you don't pay attention to the Old Testament.
Right. That actually
cannot pull them apart.
Me.
And so to understand Jesus, it's really helpful to understand Leviticus. So I know it makes us cringe. Actually, it doesn't make me cringe anymore. I get excited about it, which is weird. But it's helpful to understand what we're reading to better paint a picture of what's happening when Jesus is on the scene.
It's better to not make those assumptions of what you think is the case. Just read it for yourself.
So what do you think a good takeaway is for us today?
I think the same thing this thread that's just been constant is just remembering again today that as you hear these different regulations and these laws, it's so cool how it connects to Jesus in the New Testament, but it also is another reminder to us that God is the same. He's the same as he was with Abraham in the Old Testament, all the way up to where we are now in Leviticus with Moses and the priests, all the rules and regulations. He's the same God that was in the New Testament where Jesus is, walking around and healing these people who were under this same law, and is the same God that is with us today, that is filling us with his spirit and is a part of our everyday. So it's just it's a really cool thing when you see yourself within this really cool timeline of God and who he is and what he means to us. I just think that's really awesome. So just remember him as that. He is no different than what he was in these days that we're reading in Leviticus as well. So anyway, super cool stuff today. Stick around to listen to the episode of us reading through the text of Leviticus, and tomorrow we will enter back into some more rules, regulations of Leviticus.
Yay! See you tomorrow. Hey, thanks so much for listening to our take on God's Word. Stick around and listen to the Word on the second part of the podcast. Before we get in there, we just want to remind you, you can connect with us at any time on social media and YouTube at God's Plan, Your Part. Also, we are a listener-supported podcast, so if you ever want to help us out with the ministry that we're doing, you can do that by clicking the link in our description. And now, here's the reading for today.
Leviticus 11. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, These are the living things that you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. Whatever parts of the hoof and is cloven-footed and chews the cud among the animals you may eat. Nevertheless, among those that chew the cud, or part of the hoof, you shall not eat these. The camel, because it chews the cud but does not part the hooves, is unclean to you. And the rock badger, because it chews the cud but does not part the hoof, is unclean to you. And the hare, because it chews the cud but does not part the hoof, is unclean to you. And the pig, because it parts the hoof and is cloven-footed but does not chew the cud, it is unclean to you. You shall not eat any of their flesh, and you shall not touch their carcasses, for they are unclean to you. These you may eat, of all that are in the waters. Everything in the waters that has fins and scales, whether it is in the sea or in the rivers, you may eat. But anything in the seas and the rivers that does not have fins and scales, of the swarming creatures in the waters and of the living creatures that are in the waters, is detestable to you. You shall regard them as detestable. You shall not eat any of their flesh, and you shall detest their carcasses. Everything in the waters that does not have fins and scales is detestable to you. And these you shall detest among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are detestable. The eagle, the bearded vulture, the black vulture, the kite, the falcon of any kind, every raven of any kind, the ostrich, the nighthawk, the seagull, the hawk of any kind, the little owl, the cormorant, the short-eared owl, the barn owl, the tawny owl, the Korean vulture, the stork, the heron of any kind, the hoopoe, and the bat. All winged insects that go on all fours are detestable to you. Yet among the winged insects that go on all fours, you may eat those that have joint legs above their feet, with which to hop on the ground. Of them you may eat the locust of any kind, the bald locust of any kind, the cricket of any kind, and the grasshopper of any kind. But all other winged insects that have 4 feet are detestable to you. And by these you shall become unclean. Whoever touches their carcass shall be unclean until the evening, and whoever carries the part of their carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. Every animal that parts the hoof, but is not cloven-footed, or does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. Everyone who touches them shall be unclean. And all that walk on their paws among the animals that go on all fours are unclean to you. Whoever touches their carcasses shall be unclean until the evening. And he who carries their carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. They are unclean to you. And these are unclean to you among the swarming things that swarm on the ground: the mole rat, the mouse, the lizard of any kind, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the sand lizard, and the chameleon. These are unclean to you among all that swarm. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be unclean until the evening. And anything on which any of them falls when they are dead shall be unclean, whether it is an article of wood, or a garment, or a skin, or a sack, that any article that is used for any purpose. It must be put into water, and it shall be unclean until the evening. Then it shall be clean. And if any of them falls into any earthenware vessel, all that is in it shall be unclean, and you shall break it. Any food in it that could be eaten, on which water comes, shall be unclean. And all drink that could be drunk from every such vessel shall be unclean. And everything on which any part of their carcass falls shall be unclean. Whether oven or stove, it shall be broken in pieces. They are unclean and shall remain unclean for you. Nevertheless, a spring or a cistern holding water shall be clean, but whoever touches a carcass in them shall be unclean. And if any part of their carcass falls upon the seed grain that is to be sown, it is clean. But if water is put on the seed, and any part of their carcass falls on it, it is unclean for you. And if any animal which you may eat dies, whoever touches its carcass shall be unclean until the evening, and whoever eats of its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. And whoever carries the carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. Every swarming thing that swarms on the ground is detestable. It shall not be eaten. Whatever goes on its belly, and whatever goes on all fours, or whatever has many feet, any swarming thing that swarms on the ground, you shall not eat, for they are detestable. You shall not make yourselves detestable with any swarming thing that swarms, and you shall not defile yourselves with them, and become unclean through them. For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourselves with any swarming thing that crawls on the ground. For I am the Lord, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. This is the law about beast and bird, and every living creature that moves through the waters, and every creature that swarms on the ground, to make distinction between unclean and the clean, and between the living creature that may be eaten and the living creature that may not be eaten. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, If a woman conceives and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean for 7 days. As at the time of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall carry for 33 days in the blood of her purifying. She shall not touch anything holy, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying are completed. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks. as in her menstruation, and she shall continue in the blood of her purifying for 66 days. And when the days of her purifying are completed, whether for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb a year old for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. And he shall offer it before the Lord, and make atonement for her. Then she shall be clean from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, either male or female. If she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. And the priest shall make atonement for her, and she shall be clean.
The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, When a person has on the skin of his body a swelling or an eruption or a spot, and it turns into a case of leprous disease on the skin of his body, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons the priests, and the priest shall examine the diseased area on the skin of his body. And if the hair in the diseased area has turned white, and the disease appears to be deeper than the skin of the body, it is a case of leprous disease. When the priest has examined him, he shall pronounce him unclean. But if the spot is white on the skin of his body, and appears no deeper than the skin, and the hair in it has not turned white, the priest shall shut up the diseased person for 7 days. And the priest shall examine him on the 7th day, and if in his eyes the disease is checked, and the disease has not spread in the skin, then the priest shall shut him up for another 7 days. And the priest shall examine him again on the 7th day, and if the diseased area has faded, and the disease has not spread in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only an eruption. And he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the eruption spreads in the skin, after he has shown himself to the priest for his cleansing, he shall appear again before the priest, and the priest shall look, and if the eruption has spread in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous disease. When a man is afflicted with a leprous disease, he shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall look. And if there is a white swelling in the skin that has turned the hair white, and there is a raw flesh in the swelling, it is a chronic leprous disease in the skin of his body, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. He shall not shut him up, for he is unclean. And if the leprous disease breaks out in the skin, so that the leprous disease covers all the skin of the diseased person from head to foot, so far as the priest can see, then the priest shall look, and if the leprous disease has covered all his body, he shall pronounce him clean of the disease. It has all turned white, and he is clean. But when raw flesh appears on him, he shall be unclean. And the priest shall examine the raw flesh and pronounce him unclean. Raw flesh is unclean, for it is a leprous disease. But if the raw flesh recovers and turns white again, then he shall come to the priest. And the priest shall examine him, and if the disease has turned white, then the priest shall pronounce the diseased person clean. He is clean. If there is in the skin of the body a boil, and it heals, and in the place of the boil there comes a white swelling or a reddish-white spot, then it shall be shown to the priest. And the priest shall look, and if it appears deeper than the skin, and its hair is turned white, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a case of leprous disease that has broken out in the boil. But if the priest examines it, and there is no white hair in it, and it is no deeper than the skin, but has faded, then the priest shall shut him up for 7 days. And if it spreads in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a disease. But if the spot remains in one place and does not spread, it is the scar of the boil, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. Or when the body has a boil on the skin, and the raw flesh of the burn becomes a spot, reddish white or white, the priest shall examine it, and if the hair in the spot has turned white, and it appears deeper than the skin, then it is a leprous disease. It has broken out in the burn, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a case of leprous disease. But if the priest examines it, and there is no white hair in the spot, and it is no deeper than the skin, but has faded, the priest shall shut him up for 7 days, and the priest shall examine him the 7th day. If it is the spreading in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a case of leprous disease. But if the spot remains in one place and does not spread in the skin, but has faded, it is a swelling from the burn, and the priest shall pronounce him clean, for it is a scar of the burn. When a man or woman has a disease on the head or the beard, the priest shall examine the disease. And if it appears deeper than the skin, and the hair in it is yellow and thin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is an itch, a leprous disease of the head or the beard. And if the priest examines the itching disease, and it appears no deeper than the skin, and there is no black hair in it, then the priest shall shut up the person with the itching disease for 7 days, and on the 7th day the priest shall examine the disease. If the itch has not spread, and there is in it no yellow hair, and the itch appears to be no deeper than the skin, then he shall shave himself. But the itch he shall not shave, and the priest shall shut up the person with the itching disease for another 7 days. And on the 7th day the priest shall examine the itch, and if the itch has not spread in the skin, and it appears to be no deeper than the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the itch spreads in the skin after its cleansing, then the priest shall examine him. And if the itch has spread in the skin, the priest need not seek for the yellow hair, for he is unclean. But if in his eyes the itch is unchanged, and the black hair has grown in it, the itch is healed, and he is clean, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. When a man or a woman has spots on the skin of the body, white spots, the priest shall look, and if the spots on the skin of the body are a dull white, it is a leukoderma that has been broken out on the skin, and he is clean. If a man's hair falls out from his head, he is bald, he is clean. If a man's hair falls out from his forehead, he has baldness of the forehead, he is clean. But if there is on the bald head or the bald forehead a reddish-white diseased area, it is a leprous disease breaking out on his bald head or his bald forehead. Then the priest shall examine him, and the disease swelling, if it's reddish-white, on his bald head or his bald forehead, like the appearance of a leprous disease in the skin of the body, he is a leprous man. He is unclean. The priest must pronounce him unclean. His disease is on his head. The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes, and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. When there is a case of a leprous disease in a garment, whether a woolen or a linen garment, in warp or woof of linen or wool, or in the skin of anything made of skin, if the disease is greenish or reddish in the garment, or in the skin, or in the warp or the woof of any article made of skin, it is a case of leprous disease, and it shall be shown to the priests. And the priest shall examine the disease, and shut up that which has the disease on it for 7 days. Then he shall examine the disease on the 7th day. If the disease has spread in the garment, in the warp or the woof, or in the skin, whatever be the use of the skin, the disease is a persistent leprous disease, and it is unclean. And he shall burn the garment, or the warp, or the woof, the wool, or the linen, or any article made of skin that is diseased, for it is a persistent leprous disease. It shall be burned in the fire. And if the priest examines, and if the disease has not spread in the garment, in the warp, or the woof, or any article made of skin, then the priest shall command that they wash the thing on which is the disease, and he shall shut it up for another 7 days. And the priest shall examine the diseased thing after it has been washed. And if the appearance of the diseased area has not changed, though the disease has not spread, it is unclean. You shall burn it in the fire, whether the rot is on the back or on the front. But if the priest examines, and if the diseased area has faded after it has been washed, he shall tear it out of the garment on the skin, or the warp, or the woof. Then it appears again in the garment, in the warp or the woof, or in any article made of skin. It is spreading. You shall burn it with fire, whatever the disease. But the garment, or the warp, or the woof, or any article made of skin from which the disease departs when you have washed it, shall be then washed a 2nd time and be clean. This is the law for the case of a leprous disease in a garment, or wool, or linen, either in the warp or the woof, or in any article made of skin, to determine whether it is clean or unclean.
Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplанyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.